Welcome to Basically a Therapist, but without the degree. I am your host, Lauren Larson, and I'm honored that you're here with me in episode 29, where we are talking about why boundaries don't work. Boundaries are essential for healthy relationships and for your own personal well-being. But so often people complain that boundaries don't work in their relationships. And so I want to talk about why that is, because boundaries are important. So we're going to dive right in. So here are some common reasons why boundaries don't work. Number one, your boundaries are unclear. If boundaries are vague or confusing or not direct and straightforward, it can lead to misunderstandings. It can lead to confusion for them. It can lead to all sorts of things, resentment, bitterness, conflict that's not necessary. And so with boundaries, it is important to be specific. It's important to be clear. It's important to be direct with where you stand, with what you accept, with what you tolerate and what you don't tolerate. Another reason why boundaries don't work is there's a lack of consistency. If you are not consistent with your boundaries, there is no point for the boundary. Like if you don't plan on holding the line for your boundary is pointless. I've said this before, but people don't know where you stand if you're constantly flip-flopping. Like it's confusing when you say one thing and this is where you stand and you're not going to allow it, and then you allow it and you allow it and you allow it. That's confusing. That's not a boundary. And so people may not take you seriously. People may not respect your boundaries because you're inconsistent. Another reason why boundaries don't work is there may be a fear of conflict. Fear of conflict can make people not set boundaries or enforce boundaries and be afraid of hurting feelings. And so they'll compromise their values. They'll compromise what they need, their well-being, to avoid conflict. And this can lead to all sorts of issues: resentment, frustration, bitterness, withdrawal, avoidance, instead of just being direct. What I hear a lot of times is people are guilty about setting boundaries. They feel like it's mean, that they're going to hurt feelings, that they're going to push people away. Or maybe they don't deserve to set boundaries. Maybe, this is what I hear a lot in the church too, that they need to overextend themselves, constantly give themselves, sacrifice themselves. And while yes, that is important and we should do that to an extent, we also don't need to sacrifice our mental and emotional well-being. Like there are boundaries around that. God had boundaries. God still has boundaries. Jesus had boundaries on his time on earth. Boundaries are biblical. They're necessary. They're not mean. Like you deserve to have boundaries. Another reason why boundaries may not work is that you may have a lot of pressure from family or friends or whoever that think that you should constantly give and overextend yourself. It can be hard to be one of, if not the only person that does something different in a family. You can be looked at as the black sheep. You can be looked at as the person that has the issues, that's unhealthy, that's toxic. Whereas in reality, setting boundaries is healthy and you're trying to continue the relationship. You're trying to preserve the relationship with boundaries by showing them how to treat you. So if any of those resonate with you, you may be somebody that is impacted by not having boundaries. And this can feel like emotional burnout. You could feel a lot of stress or anger or frustration or resentment because you're feeling overwhelmed by the demands and the expectations of others. I've been there. It's exhausting. It's not a healthy way to live. Like, you're not responsible for other people. You're not responsible for their emotional well-being. And a lot of people live outside of themselves and give their control and their power away to other people. And they think that they should be the ones that are responsible for their behavior or their thoughts or their feelings. And that's not true. Each person individually is responsible for themselves. You begin and end with you. And boundaries help you establish that. Boundaries aren't walls to push people out and keep people out. They're fences, they're blueprints, they're maps on exactly how to be in relationship with you. And emotional burnout can be avoided when you have boundaries. And I know it may feel impossible because you have a family maybe, or you have a friend, or you have coworkers, you have a boss that is just constantly asking and taking and asking and taking. But for something to change, you have to change. So if you want to see something different, you need to do something different. And that's scary. I'm not minimizing how scary that is. But if you want to feel in control over your own life and leave control over other people's lives to them, boundaries is what you need. You could also feel a relational strain with people when you don't have boundaries or effective boundaries. There could be unnecessary conflict, tension, misunderstandings. Could be feeling disrespected. All of these things play a part. But with boundaries being implemented, you can lessen and or avoid those things because people know exactly where you stand and where you end and begin and what you'll tolerate and what you won't tolerate. And if you're somebody who follows through with your word, they know that you mean what you say. So when you say a boundary, when you lay down a boundary, and then there's a consequence to back it up and you actually follow through with that, they believe you. They respect you. They may not like it, but they know where you stand and they're not confused. You could also feel a loss of identity. You don't know where you begin and end. Your feelings and your thoughts may be enmeshed with other people and you're taking on their stuff and you don't really know where you're at or what you're thinking or what you're feeling. And so you may be confused on who you are and what you stand for and what you actually feel and what you think. And it's important to know who you are outside of other people. I have heard before that people don't think boundaries are kind or biblical or nice or loving, but God is a God who had boundaries and has boundaries, and Jesus during his time on earth had boundaries with his people. Like from the very beginning of the Bible, God showed boundaries. He created the earth. He created separation, light and dark, different animals, man and woman. Like he created different things. And then at the end of all of that, there was a Sabbath boundary. I'm not working on the Sabbath, and neither should you. That's a boundary. He also created the 10 Commandments, which are nothing but boundaries. Don't lie, don't steal, don't murder, don't envy. All of these things, those are all boundaries that he has for us. And if people stepped out of that, he allowed people to deal with the consequences of their decisions. Does he sometimes save people from that? Sure. But a lot of times he lets people live with the consequences of their decisions. That's a boundary. God's not an enabler. He's a gracious God. He's a merciful God, but he's not an enabler. Like, think of all of the poor decisions that you've made in your life and that you are dealing with the consequences or the rewards of those, even maybe years later. And then Jesus, I mean, how often did he pull away and go into solitude to recharge, to have time alone? And Jesus also had boundaries in his relationships. He had a core group of people, the disciples. He didn't let everybody into his inner circle. He had a specific group of people that were a part of his inner circle. He was very picky and very choosy about who he let in. And even within that inner circle, there was like an inner circle. So when people say that boundaries aren't biblical, they're not godly, go read Bible. They're all over the place. So here are some ways, some principles to set boundaries. Always lead with love and respect. Always. Boundaries shouldn't be set out of a place of anger or meanness or trying to control or manipulate. And if they are, you're doing it wrong. And if they are, it's being done wrong. Boundaries are meant to be kind and loving, and we are to love our neighbors as ourselves. And so always have love and respect when implementing boundaries. And also protect your heart. Not everybody is for you. Not everybody's going to like your boundaries. It's important to guard our hearts, like Proverbs 4:23 says. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Protect your emotional and mental well-being. That happens through boundaries. We also need to set boundaries around people that lead us away from Jesus. This is in Proverbs, and it's also in 1 Corinthians 15:33, where it says, do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. Like, we can love these people from afar, but we aren't to be intimately close with them. So if there are people that are caught up in like a sinful lifestyle, be careful with how close you are with them. Some boundaries may need to be implemented, because our relationship with God is the first priority and everything else flows from that. So we have to honor God first in our relationships. We have to honor God first in our decisions, in our thoughts, our words. So here are some ways to make boundaries effective, to help boundaries work for you. Number 1, be direct. Clear communication. It's so important to use I statements, not blaming other people, but taking control of your things, your feelings, your thoughts, and saying like, hey, this is what I need. Or when this happens, this comes up for me. I feel this. Or saying like, when things come up, I feel this. Taking control over your thoughts and your feelings and protecting them. This one, consistency and follow through are going to help your boundaries work. I know this part seems scary. This is where I hear a lot of people struggle. Like, they maybe laid down the boundary and now they're terrified to actually uphold the boundary. They just expect people to follow the boundary. But not everybody is. There's a lot of people that are just takers. And they just kind of bounce around to different people, trying to find people who they can take from. And you have to protect yourself over that. So consistency is important. Setting consequences for boundary violations is important. Letting them know when they've violated your boundaries is important. And then if it's a pattern, that's when you follow through with a consequence, whatever that is. I think it's normal to feel guilt when you set boundaries. And so allow yourself to feel that. Have that self-awareness and give yourself some grace, because it's hard. Nobody is saying that setting boundaries is easy, but it is worth it. So give yourself some grace while you're doing this. You may do it messy, but just always be clear and direct in your communication. You're allowed to change. You're allowed to try boundaries and see if they work or they don't. There's nothing wrong with that. If you feel like you don't know how to do this, if this is way too scary for you, seek some support. Go to a therapist if you need to. Find somebody that you can talk to, whether it's somebody at church or a good friend or family member that has some emotional wisdom and maturity. Talk to them about it. Seek support. If this is something that's brand new for you, this is going to probably seem kind of terrifying. I've been there. And as always, you have God, so pray and practice discernment. Seek God's guidance through prayer, not just talking, but listening to Him, and ask Him for His wisdom and His discernment on how to handle these situations, on who should be in your life, on who is for you and who's not for you. Let God show you. Let God open your eyes to the people that are around you. And as I said last week, that we have access to the mind of God, we also have access to His strength. We have access to His fruits of the Spirit, self-control and strength. We have access to His power. So tap into that. Rely on the Holy Spirit. These are going to be game changers for your relationships and for you. Boundaries work if you work boundaries. Like, you have to follow through with them. They only work if you work. Boundaries will also show you who your people are. Boundaries have a really good way of showing you who the real people are for you. And that doesn't make the other people bad or wrong. It just makes them not for you. But if you want to live a life that's authentic, if you want to live a life where you are surrounded by supportive people, if you want to live a life that is emotionally mature and healthy, boundaries are going to help with that. And you have no idea how boundaries can positively affect other people in their lives. I've seen it so much for me since I've implemented boundaries and started talking about them. So many people have realized that they need boundaries. And you just don't know how many other people that you can help on the other side of your yes and your follow through. You can even help the people that you're setting boundaries with. There are so many people that are just boundaryless, even for themselves. And maybe you placing a boundary will help them, will show them that it's possible. I hope that this episode was helpful. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, like this episode, and share it with somebody that you think needs some help in their boundary life. And I will see you next week. Bye.
Yeah.